Welcome back. I am your film professor, and today we're going to look at how Christopher Nolan challenges the traditional Hollywood approach to visual scene structure, and how he leans on one particular type of scene transition to move the audience seamlessly through the narrative. Now, traditionally in film, when watching the scene, we as the audience see the wide shot first. This orients the audience to what is happening, it establishes the location, and more importantly, who is in the scene, who is not, and where the characters are spatially in relation to one another. Then, as the scene builds, the camera moves closer to the subjects into a medium, and then even tighter. This is known as going wide to tight. If you watched the previous video comparing the coverage of David Fincher and Antoine Fuqua, you saw examples of how these scenes are traditionally shot and edited, with those filmmakers using the traditional wide to tight approach. Christopher Nolan, however, flips this traditional editing sequence on its head. Instead of going wide to tight in most of his scenes, he will most often go tight to wide, which means starting a scene with a tighter shot, such as a close-up or a medium, then moving to a looser composition, then ultimately to an even wider shot to orient the audience. Why does Nolan use this approach so often? What's the benefit of starting tight and building out instead of the other way around? I believe the benefit here is audience participation. With a traditional sequence of wide to tight, the information is presented to the audience, making them passive observers in the film, as the information they need is given to them straight away. However, in a tight to wide approach, like Nolan's, the audience must be active participants in the scene. Let's take this opening scene from Inception as an example. We start on tight shots of water crashing. Are we in a river, an ocean? We have no context, which makes us engage as the audience and start to piece together what's happening. When we get our first shot of Leo here, we see that there's someone in the scene, but we don't know, are they dying? Are there other people in the scene with them? When we see the shots of the children, it raises the interest in the scene, but because we haven't had a wide shot yet, we don't know spatially where they are in relation to our character who's in the water on the beach. Are they 100 yards apart, a mile apart? Are they even there? Or perhaps they're a dream or a flashback. It's this withholding of information that really engages the audience into the film. Now, the introduction of the gun ups the stakes, as now we have an element of danger. And the question of where we are is satisfied with the final shot of the sequence, when we finally get our wide. Here are frames from each shot in the sequence so you can see how the scene is visually constructed. This tight to wide approach teases out information for the viewer, making them engaged to follow the characters in the story. Now, the traditional studio approach would be to start the scene with the wide shot and use a lower third that says, perhaps, Japan, present day, which would turn the audience into a passive observer instead of an active one. Nolan's decision to let the audience piece the scene together, and the film itself as it unfolds, provides for a much more satisfying viewing experience. This really follows the advice of the great director Ernst Lubitsch, who once told Billy Wilder, "Let the audience add up 2 + 2, they'll love you forever." Now, no director only uses one approach in every scene in their film. The editing style must be varied, but Nolan overwhelmingly uses a tight to wide scene structure. And now that we know how Christopher Nolan structures his scenes, we need to examine how he transitions from scene to scene. A scene transition is simply the process of moving the audience from one scene to the next, and with the exception of poor audio, lack of scene transitions is perhaps the biggest indicator of an amateur production. Now, Nolan will use some of the traditional scene transitions, from dissolves to establishing shots to reveals, but if you carefully examine his scene transitions, you find something surprising. The transitions that Christopher Nolan uses the most, by far, are not visual transitions, but audio transitions. In particular, J-cuts and L-cuts. A J-cut is a scene transition where we see the ending of the first scene, but we start to hear the audio of the next scene before we cut to the video of that next scene. Here's an example.
The area will take you only so far.
Hello.
Hi. We missed him.
An L-cut is the reverse of the J-cut. In an L-cut scene transition, we cut to the video of a new scene, but continue to hear the audio of the previous scene. Here's an example.
We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
But why would Christopher Nolan rely so heavily on J-cuts? The answer is his unique approach to scene structure we examined earlier. In starting his scenes with tighter coverage and skipping a traditional scene bridge, such as a long dissolve or an establishing shot, it can be very jarring for the audience to just be thrust into the middle of a scene. The most effective way to smooth out this abrupt transition is to use a J-cut, which uses the audio to smoothly transition the audience from one scene to the next. Now, the use of J-cuts and L-cuts also has the added benefit of quickening the pace of the film, as we don't have to use the wide establishing before moving into the tighter coverage, which is where the bulk of the scene will really play. This tight to wide approach, aided by J&L cuts, give the scene and ultimately the film itself the feeling of forward momentum. Compared to his contemporaries like Edgar Wright, Wes Anderson, and others who use elaborate visual scene transitions, it's ironic that Christopher Nolan, who has created some of the most visually arresting images in modern cinema and has been derided for his use of audio in his films, actually relies on the audio more than the video when transitioning from scene to scene. Now, if you want to dig even deeper and study how Christopher Nolan or any other filmmakers use scene transitions and how they structure the editing of their scenes, I would encourage you to watch their films with the sound off. Once you're able to disconnect from following the plot and the dialogue, you can really see how the visuals of a film are constructed. Hopefully this will help you in creating and polishing your own film projects. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.